Well, welcome everyone to the latest edition of GCV's The Next Wave webinar series. I'm Fernando Moncada, Senior Reporter at GCV, and today we're talking about the changing world of sports and how to effectively invest in it. And with so much going on and off the field or court, or table if you're into ping pong or something, we've got together a panel of three experts to help walk us through these rapidly shifting sands, really, rapidly shifting landscape. And first of all, just to introduce you to our panel here. Firstly, we have Kerry Carter, a former professional athlete playing in the NFL and the CFL, the Canadian Football League. And currently, as an investor, he's a venture partner at Treehouse, as well as chief executive officer at Atavis, a company focused on tackling safety, and where he also previously served as COO. We also have Chris Traeger, executive director at Boomtown, where he oversees a relationship with Comcast, NBC Universal, and their sports tech accelerator program, bringing with him decades of experience in sports and entertainment. And last but not least, taking part in that accelerator program, we have Tim Brownstone, a scientist by training who founded and is CEO of Chimera, a startup which I hesitate to simply call a high-tech apparel company because the technology is so much more than that. But we'll get into that in just a little bit. And just to preview some of the areas that we want to touch on through the discussion, and it's a non-exhaustive list, but just to give you a flavor of what's coming up. We want to talk about things including the evolution of the sporting world, how far it's come along and where it is today, different routes to market for startups, as well as the challenges that they face in the space, collaboration between startups and corporates, what the exit landscape looks like, as well as, what investors and startups should know if they want to get involved and invest here. So then just to bring out our panel, Kerry, Tim, and Chris. Hi, how's everyone doing? Everyone's looking good. Let's start maybe, before we get started, really, let's, and I know I just introed you guys, but I'm sure there's stuff I missed. So let's just go around, give, quick, let's call them 30-second elevator intro. And maybe we can start with you, Kerry.
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me. Fernando, it's always a pleasure to be on with such esteemed guests. And yeah, you did a great job on mine, man. Former professional athlete, turned to the business world and tech world back in 2011 when I finished playing. It's been serial entrepreneur and got involved with Atavis a few years back. Been there now going on almost 7 years. Company was acquired back in 2019, stayed on board, took over as COO, and then recently took over as CEO. And in that same time, really been involved in the sports tech landscape, both from obviously from an operations perspective, but also looking at opportunities to invest in the space as well. So really excited about what we're doing on the side with Treehouse and Treehouse Studios, and we'll get into that a little bit more as we go. But thanks for having me.
Thanks, Kerry. How about you, Chris?
Thanks, Fernando. Really appreciate you having me here today, and it's an honor to speak to the crowd here. So I've been in the sports industry for a long time in a variety of roles, including in-house counsel for Octagon and Bank of America, marketing for Bank of America, and working on their sports properties, as well as working on the league side with NASCAR, and then spearheading a team with Legends in Vegas, where we sold the Allegiant Stadium property for the Raiders there. And I've started working with early stage companies about 6 years ago in earnest, because I saw there's a lot of really interesting technologies coming forward, and the sports industry and the entertainment industry, the media industry, really is going through a rapid evolution in many ways. And larger companies are doing a great job adapting, but they also need help from outside, with earlier stage companies who are seeing things differently and willing to experiment and take risks more. And so our job at Boomtown is to go out and find awesome companies and founders who are taking courageous moves to change the landscape in any number of aspects of the sports entertainment industry and the media industry, bring those ideas to Comcast and its partners, and figure out how those ideas and new technologies might improve the experience of the fan, the viewer, the athlete, et cetera. And so we're really honored to have Comcast as our champion, our client, our partner in our program. And unlike a lot of other big companies I've worked with, they're super collaborative. They're very curious, and they trust us to do some really interesting experimentation in the innovation space. And so it's been a really cool journey for the last 3+ years when I've been working with this team. And so we have hundreds of executives within Comcast and NBC Sports and Xfinity and Sky Sports that work with us alongside our partners who you see on the screen behind me. And one of my favorite things to do is to talk to CEOs, innovators, founders, and see how they might be able to help us and our partners with some innovation and some evolution of the business. So thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. And how about you, Tim?
So yes, a pleasure to be here, Fernando, and likewise, hi everybody that's watching and listening. So Tim Brownstone, I'm a former athlete turned scientist turned entrepreneur for my sins, and I founded Chimera last year, so my senior year of college, and we make the use of life-changing technologies as simple as getting dressed. In a nutshell, the majority of my sort of day-to-day is spent in the human performance space, which for us we kind of consider as sport is one pillar of that, but then you get wellness and you get medical, all of which we consider human performance. So very excited to bring a perspective for everybody today.
Thanks, and definitely excited to dig into that. So let's start off maybe with the big picture. And by the way, just a reminder to the audience, we do have a Q&A function right here on the Zoom platform. So please do send in your questions throughout the session, and we'll do our best to get to them. But yeah, let's start off with the big picture a bit, and then we can dig in a bit more. I want to get an idea of how you guys have perceived, the sports world changing in recent years. What have been the kind of biggest waves, as it were, and maybe Chris, we can start with you. How have you seen the world of sports changing, and also how have those changes, I suppose, impacted your investment approach?
Yeah, well, there's so much change. You could probably just talk about what the change is for 3 hours, not just an hour. But I think in summary, when we look at the media landscape and consumption habits and how people spend their time, there's been massive shifts, especially since the advent of mobile devices, where, when I was younger, you watched cable and you saw long format video, and you played a lot of sports and you interacted with people, doing touch football or that sort of thing. And now many people are in the gaming space more so, in esports gaming. There's also a huge migration towards all the social media channels, and most people are spending a huge chunk of their time on the small screen, where that erosion of the large format video watching has really been life-changing for a lot of folks, in good and bad ways, right? So it's more community, it's more interesting, the content's more engaging, you can measure things more, but it also presents some challenges to those of us who love watching 3-hour games. And then on the athletics side, I think there's certain sports like golf that have really benefited from COVID, where people just wanted to get outside and be distanced, and they took up a new passion. Pickleball is another example where people started something new, and there's been a really interesting groundswell of women's sports evolving, and probably should have evolved more in terms of viewership and content creation years ago on the women's sports side. And then you also have traditional sports where people have been watching their favorite sport as much, if not more than ever, but they're consuming it totally differently. And then youth participation in certain sports has gone way off the charts, and in others it's kind of flattened out. So it kind of depends on the nature of the sport and where people are going. But physical activity and team sports became harder during COVID, and a lot of those team sports got suspended, and some of the younger folks lost a little bit of interest as a result. And now you got to get those people back. So there's trends across every aspect of it, from participation all the way through viewership and engagement and marketing to the fans and things like that. And so it's a fascinating time to be in the evolution and technology business to try to facilitate some of those growth opportunities for Comcast and others. So
it's interesting when you talk about the kind of drop off in youth sports, at least that post pandemic, is that something that's keenly felt?
Well, I think there's certain people, certain families that are all in on youth sports. And so, Sports Engine still has 34 million users of its platform and tens of millions of events that it supports. So there's still a lot of people participating. It's just people might be shifting their time. where some people are shifting more of their time towards playing more recreational sports and less competitive team sports. And it kind of depends on age level and things like that. So, but there's still, you know, millions of high school athletes. There's still millions of junior athletes. It's just, there's more opportunities to play different things now. You know, it used to be 10 years ago, there was probably 8 or 10, 12 high school sports that people were focused on, both male and female. And now there's all of these other activities and teams and leagues developing outside of your traditional high school funnel. And there's all these regional competitions and tournaments and travel teams and things and a lot of those travel teams had to take a pause for a little while during COVID because of natural reasons. Now they're really starting to accelerate back. And so you just see ebbs and flows in the participation habits, and some people maybe took up a new sport during COVID because of some of the restrictions, and that might have impacted the number of hours they can spend on the sport they used to play. So it's been really interesting to see those trends develop, but certainly youth participation is still very strong, and there's just some shifting happening. So
interesting. And do those changes that Chris described there, Kerry, does that kind of track with what you've been seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to jump in on that. You know, as you talk about like how things have shifted, like you'll take football for an example, right? You've seen a decline in, you know, overall youth tackle football, high school tackle football, you know, some programs going down, but then you shift over and you see this huge rise in flag football, right? You know, across the board nationally, and even especially on the women's side, like really a lot of young girls getting into flag, and I think that shift it's a natural thing, right? There was some hesitancy and trepidation around tackle football because of, you know, all the reports around, you know, concussions and traumatic brain injury, and you know, you see all these negative things around it. And that's, you know, part of, you know, what my mission has been, is like, how do we make sure that coaches and parents and athletes are getting the things that they need to feel more confident in that space? But I absolutely think that having flag as an option is great for the sport in general. You know, not everyone needs to be tackling and hitting and banging heads early on. I think you can learn a lot from it and grow within that space. And if you want to continue, it's just offering more options for athletes as they grow. And for me, it's as long as they're being active and they're getting out there and they're doing something, you know, to address the activity and the obesity epidemics that we've seen in this country, that's more important than anything. But yeah, I absolutely agree that the shift has been seen, you know, and even you know, with the non-traditional options like esports and whatnot, you know, it's creating new communities. And I think that's a big part of sport is like connection and community. And so, you know, as that shifts, I don't think it's necessarily a negative thing. I think it's just a reshuffling of priorities for the athletes and also for parents as well, you know, within many different sports and sectors.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And I want to come back later in the conversation to the topic of safety and how that's kind of having an impact. But yeah, Tim, did you have anything to add there?
I think, you know, if I was just to summarize it, I would say that sport is becoming more personalized. That doesn't mean that we're purely shifting to individual sports, but whether you're an athlete whose training program is now a program for that one individual versus a standardized one that the entire squad is doing, or whether it's you as a consumer, how you are watching and viewing your sport, the whole experience throughout is becoming that much more personalized. And, you know, I think that's been something that ought to have happened sooner, has been accelerated by the pandemic, and, you know, practices that then, you know, best practice that have remained now that we're coming out of it. And, you know, it's an evolution that was waiting to happen, and, you know, fortunately definitely is very much here and accelerating as we go.
So then following from that, then let's talk about routes to market for a bit. So if we were to, you know, very crudely, perhaps, you know, split sports, you know, startups or investments into like 2 rough buckets, right? One that's focused on the kind of the athlete and the performance, and the other maybe more focused on the fan experience and the media side of things and everything that falls into that bucket. You know, conventional wisdom might suggest that the former, you know, the sports performance side might have a, you know, slightly longer route to adoption, and maybe even longer route to the kind of mass market. Is that a correct way to look at it? And maybe, you know, Tim, since you're in that space, maybe you'd be good to speak on it.
So I think, speaking from our personal experience, you know, it comes back to who you know and what you know when you're starting that business. But particularly, while we have a solution for the athlete, very much, the bulk of our business is not necessarily the athletes directly, it's the team, it's the organization. And so when you then compare to fan experience, that is also, the client, the user is the fan, but the client is the team or the league. And so you can draw similarities in that sense. And I think once you start understanding the space, you also learn very small adaptations in language, which then speak to different stakeholders throughout an organization. So, for example, if we're talking to directors of performance or directors of medical, and indeed the equipment guys and girls, we'll be speaking more about injury prevention and how improving recovery modalities, etc., can protect athletes. If we're then speaking to the GM or the CFO of an organization, we're talking about asset protection. That there is a cost inherently to having an injured athlete that you're paying a salary, and therefore that that cost is a direct thing that the organization is absorbing. But likewise, I was once shared a statistic that one time when LeBron was injured, I think he was meant to be going to I think it was the Rockets, and there he was on kind of like is he going to come back for this game, or will it be the following game that he's series that he's back in for? And once he confirmed he wasn't going to be in for the Rockets game, ticket sales fell 30%. So all of a sudden, you now have a reason that while your solution is for the athletes, to be speaking to the marketing and the commercial team, because having your biggest name available is not just good for winning, it's good for ticket sales, it's good for advertising, it's good for media. And so really, it's a holistic viewpoint that you need to take if you want to be successful in growing in this industry. And so having a route to market that speaks to all the different stakeholders, and there's, again, you need to personalize that to make sure the message is heard in the language that those folks are expecting it.
Yeah, and maybe just to provide a bit of context there, Tim, can you just briefly explain, how your technology helps kind of athletes in injury prevention and stuff like that?
Sure. So I will keep it light on the science, but basically we have developed materials that have a infrared emitting technology in them that we then make a range of apparel with, and that captures visible light, body heat, and other forms of energy in the surroundings and converts it into infrared, pumping it into the athlete's muscles. That causes a number of different kind of biochemical reactions that ultimately mean that they are more supple, they have more blood flow in the areas that they're wearing our products, their muscles become less injury prone. There are some direct performance enhancing benefits. And then, we accelerate the recovery process. So I mentioned at the top of the session that I span this out of my college research. I was doing the research for wound healing applications. And we've basically taken, how do you heal a wound quicker into every time an athlete participates in sport, or an individual, whether they deem themselves an athlete or not, in any form of physical activity, we're causing some form of micro tears in the muscle. And so if we can accelerate how quickly those heal and repair, we can accelerate what's called chronic adaptation, which is getting fitter, stronger, leaner, whatever you're training for. And the overall outcomes, you basically get an extra gear, but you're doing so more safely.
Yeah, and breaking that into the kind of sports apparel market, I think that last time we spoke, you said something quite interesting, which was that, perhaps counterintuitively, going into a market with a lot of competitors, especially if they're fractured, if it's a fragmented market rather, is actually easier than going into one where maybe there's a handful of really dominant firms, right? Incumbents. So.
Yeah, so the point I made was that launching in a crowded and competitive market can sometimes be much easier. And it's a big misconception with the sports market. And forgive me, this is a slightly dated statistic, but I think big 3 or 5 at the time whom had over $2 billion a year in revenue, they only accounted for, I think, about 12% of the global sporting apparel market. And most of them, with Under Armour being the main exception, are principally footwear providers, not apparel. The apparel is licensed out, or it's it's a separate business unit and not the mainstay. And so actually the consumer, because there is so much choice, is used to looking around, and brand loyalty, not in every area of sport. Some areas like cycling and triathlon have incredibly high brand loyalty, but generally speaking is more used to shopping around for what's out there. And so the example I kind of gave to yourself, Fernando, is if I asked you to go and buy me a brown fizzy sticky liquid that I can drink, but I can also clean my engine with, you'll likely go buy me a Coke or a Pepsi, not Tim's weird and wonderful garden brew, because it's a dominated market. Whereas in the highly competitive landscape, there's an increased chance of discovery. The challenge comes to how do you scale in that? Once you've kind of filled your early adopter quota, how do you then start scaling? Because that's when it becomes more competitive and, you know, more expensive, because there's more competition, you know, in terms of getting eyeballs, and therefore the digital, the print, whatever form of media you're promoting in, you know, the cost per acquisition goes up.
And I want to come back to scaling in just a bit, but I want to get, you know, Chris and Carrie's view from an investor's point of view on that kind of athlete-centric versus fan-centric, you know, rough split, as it were. How do you guys see the prospect for each?
Yeah, I'm a big believer in kind of and thinking, and so a lot of people say, "Oh, do you go sell to elite athletes and their trainers, or do you go to the consumers?" And you know, a lot of the shift in media consumption and the media channel mix has actually, I believe, made earlier stage companies more likely to succeed. And I'll give you an example. So if you think about like the OnCloud brand, you know, and how they've gone to market, they don't have massive television ad campaigns like you had to have 5-10 years ago. You know, it used to be, okay, you got to have a $40 million ad campaign to launch a new consumer apparel or shoe brand, because all the channels are really expensive and mass and highly curated. Now with the advent of social media and more influencer marketing and some of the different channels out there and different ways to consume, even things like YouTube, you think about like Livy Dunn and Vori, like that's a brand that no one heard of a few years ago, and then they found a really dynamic, young, successful athlete at a high profile, you know, college program, and had her become the centerpiece of it. And so they've been able to make a pretty decent dent in the marketplace very quickly without having to produce a $2 million glossy TV commercial and do a big, you know, digital ad campaign on all of like ESPN.com and things like that. Or, you know, so there's this proliferation of channels and availabilities. It makes it easier for you to combine the work streams. So, you know, in Tim's case, he's working with elite athletes and their trainers and you know, athletic departments at colleges and major pro programs. If you have a few of those athletes who love the product and are willing to endorse it and utilize their audiences, I mean, some of these individual athletes have a bigger audience than some of the major brands do by themselves, right? And so you don't have to necessarily spend a lot of money on creative and channel planning and all these things in order to grow market share on the consumer side. So, but in order to do that and break through in this consumer-led influencer generation and all the channels, you kind of need to have some people who have an audience. And whether that's an audience because they're an awesome athlete or because they're just really funny or entertaining or both, hey, you know, that's what you got to find. And so I think you parallel path it. And so that's a hard thing for a lot of investors to understand is, well, you know, you got to focus. And it's like, well, yeah, I mean, there's such a thing as not going so far afield where you're building new things that are totally outside your comfort zone or your expertise or your channel mix in terms of how you build a product. But certainly, you know, you can do a couple of things well at once and have them be additive. Work with the elite athletes, promote to the consumers, sell an athlete product that also is a consumer product. So.
Yeah, well said, Chris. And I completely agree on that. I think where it gets difficult for some is when, you know, you try the top-down model and you're trying to get into like just a pro team or just you know, an elite athlete and a trainer. Because, you know, in terms of trying to get that feedback, I think Tim mentioned this, it is about who you know at that point too, and how well those connections are. Because to get someone to try something new within different verticals, it can become really difficult, time consuming, you know, a lot of selling into pro teams. They get so many things coming to them. Their expectations are different. The sales cycles are different. You know, sales timelines are extremely long. And, you know, this expectation of they get most things given to them and they don't have to give a lot back in return. So you as a as a startup, if you're trying to break into that space, without having some organic connections, or some authorities within the space, or finding the right partners like an Olivia Dunn, like like these the college athlete, pro athletes who have a built-in audience, it can become time consuming, really difficult, hard to scale. But exactly what Chris said in terms of taking kind of that dual path, where you're selling into a team, but you're also talking directly to the athlete. And if you can find the right mix of the acceptance and that connection and the authentic connection with the athlete, your path to growth and acceleration is a lot faster, because they have this. I think that's the biggest thing that's happened with social media right now. There is nothing in between the athlete, celebrity, influencer, and that audience. So the ability for them to speak directly and tell you authentically how they're feeling, and these connections that they're making, gives a lot of credence to anything that they say, any product that they put in front of them. And even that is continuing to shift, right? Like the way that content marketing is done now, and the way that athletes are speaking about it. It's not, you may have a huge audience, but if your engagement levels aren't high, people can also see, people can tell if you're authentic, if you actually are using something, if you're talking about it in a way that, man, this, I use this on a daily basis. Here's what I'm seeing. Here's what I'm experiencing from it. I think people are much more connected to that authenticity right now, and I think that's what moves the needle across the board when it comes to new products, new services, and things that are being marketed in a truly authentic way. So I love where it is right now. I love that you can find these pathways, and it makes that, it makes it exciting for new entrepreneurs entering the space, to be able to connect earlier and actually get some feedback on their products and get to that next stage. But then it really, at some point you will hit that ceiling, and where you're getting the right channels to market in an effective way does get costly. So the more goodwill, the more you can build up early on, it'll help you kind of cross that chasm when you get to that point as well.
Which kind of brings us back to the scaling question, right? And like you said, Tim, even if it, in some segments it might be easier than others to break in, but then growing it is where the real challenge is. So where have those kind of bottlenecks been for you?
So for us, we brought in our first professional and collegiate clients in 2018. First professional was the England rugby team here in the UK, and first collegiate was University of Texas. Both big names in their respective sports, obviously Texas in multiple sports. And I'll be very honest, I thought, right, we've got Texas, we're off to the races. But that expectation that it would just translate because we had a big name, that wasn't enough. And to the same point that Kerry's making there with regards to authenticity and the story, the narrative that's being told, we're no longer in the place, and particularly with the evolution of the NIL space within the college market, where just because Texas is doing it, that means that we have to do it, with regards to if it's Texas Tech, for example. And so the piece that we had to navigate was building up a network of referral partners rather than just going back to that one individual. And once we hit a critical mass, which we then achieved in 2020, funny enough, during the pandemic, where most of our market had disappeared, it very quickly then started to snowball from there.
I'll chime in there. And I think, partnerships really are the name of the game for scaling, right? So that's and our platform at Comcast Sports Tech is really built off of that principle, that foundation of partnerships, right? So there's a lot of things that the Philadelphia Flyers, which are part of Comcast Spectacor, there's a lot of things the Flyers can do on their own in terms of athlete performance or media consumption or venue and event experience. But the reason why we bring partners to the table is that it's really helpful to have different partners collaborate together and learn from each other. And then that also helps people scale. So like one example I would use within our family is Comcast Business is a really interesting piece of the Comcast family tree, where they're selling technology services through to many of the household names you work with every day or you go to every day, whether it be a restaurant chain or a hospital or hotel or airline. they're working with all of them to provide technology service. And like, well, what does that have to do with sports? What we've discovered is they also happen to service 140 something stadiums. They put the technology into arenas and football stadiums all around the country and the world. So that's an interesting place for example, with Chimera, you know, you have the Flyers using the technology, the apparel, and then, you know, people talk, right? So the Ian with the Flyers then talks to others counterparts in the NHL, and then he also happens to know people in the NFL or the MLB, because they travel in the same circles and they work in the same areas and they go to the same conferences, et cetera. And so those partnerships can be really powerful. And frankly, you're not going to sell through a new technology to any credible brand or credible executive unless you have some proven test or POC or use case, right? So for Tim, yeah, he can do all the great work behind the scenes that he can, but when Tim, when you approached England Rugby, that was probably your most difficult conversation, right? And then once you had a partner, then other partners recognize that there's credibility there, and then the other partners happen. And then you have people like the University of Texas saying, hey, this is really awesome, Texas Tech trainers and athletic performance people. You should probably try this out. And then there's this network effect. And so we always look for those one-to-many relationships where a salesperson at Comcast Business can walk a technology into 20 different brands in the course of their daily routine, or a Flyers executive can go to an NHL league-wide meeting and talk to, you know, 20 plus other trainers or athletic folks about a particular product like Chimera. So it's like, without those partnerships, it's really difficult for any startup to scale and gain credibility. So it's really the foundation of what we do every day, is develop new partnerships and make sure they're meaningful and one-to-many.
And I would attest to having experienced that as well. So definitely kudos for that.
Yeah.
So then I believe the first listener question was
Roger, who's asking which area is getting the most investor interest: sports gambling, athlete performance, health, brand stickiness, fan experience, and he's, you know, acknowledging that there's a crossover between them.
perfect. Well, there you go. Who wants to take the first crack at that one?
I mean, I'm happy to jump in from.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. All right. So, I mean, I would say that 10 years ago, fan engagement, fan experience, 100% was ruling the roost where it came to sports investments. And it's recently the athlete performance side has been trending upwards, certainly, and in the US at least, sports gambling obviously is becoming a far bigger thing, whereas the rest of the world, it's been there for a much longer period of time. One thing I'll say is that part of, in my company eye view, which, you know, Kerry and Chris can speak to investor eye views, is that fan engagement was previously more of a lead, because back then sports investors were looking to invest specifically in the sports market. And the issue with the athlete performance side is that that's, you know, it's got a cap on it. Whereas, you know, the fan engagement had, you know, more properties around the world. It was seen as more scalable. One thing that I've definitely noticed in terms of the thesis that different funds are pursuing now, where it comes to athlete performance, is, like I spoke to at the top of the call, performance is not just sports. So it's a sandbox in the sporting and elite space, but actually the scaling and growth opportunity is how do you get into the general population? That could be a consumer-facing brand. That could be spilling into medical, into wellness, into defense applications. You know, that, so it's looking at what else is there that this business and its technology can service beyond just the sporting vertical.
I was going to add to that. I think, you know, in terms of how things have kind of shifted and evolved, I agree completely, where a lot of the focus was in that one-to-many approach. That's where they could see growth. But I think the growth of an expansion of sports leagues as a whole right now, I think, is seeing a ton of interest and investment as it expands, you know, globally, right? So, you know, new leagues popping up in the US, and volleyball. Obviously, we talked a little bit about, you know, pickleball and things like that are happening here, but also the huge investments that are going into things like leagues in Africa. I know NBA is focused a lot on Africa. The NFL is expanding into new markets globally, going into, you know, Germany and even Mexico and different places like that, and offering the rights to different teams. You know, I think just the globalization of some of these sports leagues as a whole is seeing a ton of interest, ton of investment, and not just here domestically, but a lot of international investors especially are really looking into those spaces a lot. And for me, I think one thing that has been really cool to see is the shift in athletes getting involved in the investments as well, right? And not just from a performance perspective, but they're getting into buying leagues and teams and things like that, but also looking internationally for opportunities to expand and building their own funds. So that, to me, as you know, compensation has shifted and changed and grown, you know, over the years with each league, and you know, guys are making a lot more money, getting bigger contracts, so they're looking for ways to grow, you know, kind of their legacy and investing back into what they know, which I think is a great route for athletes, is to you know, focus on the things that you know really well and look at how your individual expertise and feedback can really help some of those investments. So whether it's you know, an individual team or a league or something that they're trying to grow and expand on a global scale, you know, just selfishly being an ex-athlete myself, I love to see that, right? And they kind of contrast some of the numbers that we've seen historically in terms of what happens to athlete post career. You know, the NFL numbers have been really glaring in terms of, you know, folks within 3 to 4 years of their career ending, you know, being in financial hardship or bankruptcy, things like that. So for me, seeing the interest and the investment going into these different spaces actually helps a lot of athletes to kind of continue and grow what they've built, extend their legacy. But you know, it doesn't just help them, it helps, you know, a lot of people you know, along the line too. So it's a little different perspective on it, but I do think, you know, that's a really interesting area that's been growing, just, you know, from the athlete perspective.
Yeah, and just to kind of echo that a bit, I think you know, and it's not just, you know, the leagues expanding, but I think new sports also are getting more traction, and going back to the kind of rise in OTT and different kind of distribution models for people to watch. I think, and I was, you know, I mentioned last time we spoke that, you know, if ESPN8 from Dodgeball was a real thing with the obscure sports, I'd be on there all the time. That would be my home base. But yeah, sorry, I think you were going to say something, Chris.
Yeah, no, Fernando, that's well said, and I totally agree with that. And I was just going to build on what Kerry was saying. It's, you know, I think it's really interesting when you look at the last few years. There's been a lot more interest in a variety of aspects of sport. And you know, it's really when we talk to our companies that are in our portfolio about their discussions with investors, you know, pre-pandemic, there was a huge amount of investment coming in, and there's a lot of people writing checks, relatively speaking. Pandemic happens, some of that subsided, and people got more cautious for a variety of reasons. And so I don't really look at it as like investor interest. That's a very broad question. So like I would break it down and say, well, there's some investors that are really interested in technology, and we kind of live a little bit more in that space. There's other investment firms that are focused on equity stakes in teams or leagues or building new events. So there's different verticals within the investor landscape. I would think within the technology investor landscape, yeah, I mean, sports gambling is an interesting one just because in North America, it's become more legalized and more prevalent, and there's different tools. But what we've noticed with sports gambling startups in particular is there's a very heavy regulatory burden on you know, on anybody who's you know, placing bets and paying bets. And so you almost have to start with that free to play skill contest. And really what sports teams and leagues want, they don't necessarily want gambling for the sake of gambling. What they want is more interaction and more engagement, more first party data. And they see gambling as one of the ways to do that. One thing that we are focused on, and we're trying to help the leagues and teams focus on in the technology space, is there's been a proliferation of what I'll call intermediaries over the last 30 years. So in the ticketing space, you have a lot of ticketing companies that are the go-between. Like if you want access to a stadium, you're going to a Ticketmaster or StubHub or one of those. you really can't walk up to a stadium like you could 50 years ago and buy a ticket from the team, right? It just doesn't exist anymore. On the concession side, there's concessionaires where you're buying food from Levy restaurants or, those kind of companies, Delaware North, and then they're partnering with the team and the stadium. On the media side, it was the regional sports networks, and more it's becoming the social media platforms where people are going to consume content, talk about their favorite team, post content about their favorite team. And those social media networks are partners of the teams, but they don't often share data. And let's face it, those social media channels look at those people as their customers, which is fair because they're logged in their environment and they're sharing their information there. And so if I were to say, like, one important thing for teams and leagues to do is realizing that that trend is not going to go away. You're not going to get rid of all the intermediaries because it's complicated. But how do teams and leagues gain more first party relationships with their fans and do it in a way where they can interact and get to know those fans, know those customers better, and serve them better? And so that goes to fan experience, it goes to fan engagement, it goes to viewership habits and consumption habits and engagement habits. And it also goes to what you're willing to buy, both from the team itself and then also their sponsors. The sponsors are there not because they're good corporate citizens per se, or because they're trying to be good, citizens to their local community. People sponsor the Minnesota Vikings because they want to get to the Vikings fans to sell them more sneakers and hot dogs and sandwiches and brake pads, right? They don't necessarily, some of it's altruistic, much of it's commercial because they're publicly traded companies and they have shareholders to answer to. So to me, it's like if I'm sitting at a pro team at a leadership role, I'm trying to figure out different technologies that can help me build better relationships, one-to-one relationships with my fans wherever they are, whether it's in my stadium, on different digital media platforms where they're viewing sports, consuming, engaging. And when they're buying things from me, I'm trying to figure out how I can build a community around that so I can remarket to them and not let my external partners do all of the marketing and all of the engagement on my behalf, because that's a dangerous place for the teams to be where they can't monetize their own fans directly. So.
And I'll add one last piece. I think this aligns really well with, what we're seeing in terms of personalization of the athlete investment, right? Like if you get a better product on the field and you're able to show growth and winning cures a lot, right? So to your point previously about LeBron and how that shifted, the amount of tickets being sold. Like think about how all this work that you're doing on the fan engagement side to understand the consumer and see what their habits are. You give them the best experience in person. If they come to that stadium and your team is losing every game, it makes it hard for all the parties involved, right? So I think that's the area where adding, or looking at the technologies that can enhance the performance of athletes, recovery, all those things, like they really work well together, to kind of increase and improve the overall experience, because it benefits, winning benefits everybody. Putting a good product out on the field benefits everyone, including the fans, including the teams, and the folks that are investing in these as well. So I thought that was just, worth mentioning.
So yeah, how much more important then has fan data collection, collecting data on the fans on your market effectively become over the past few years?
Well, I'll start on that one. I mean, it's this almost like a sleeping giant dynamic where third-party cookies have been essentially wiped out by regulatory changes, particularly in the U.S., but elsewhere. And so it used to be you could figure out who was consuming content or going to a certain page passively without any permission, and then you had to get their permission, and now you really can't track that activity as well. And so there's got to be other ways to interact with people where you get their permission, you build that relationship, but then you figure out how to interact with them one-to-one and not as much through the intermediaries, right? So that is one of the most important things, because if you're a marketer and you're trying to reach whether you're a team marketer and trying to sell tickets, or whether you're a brand trying to sell beverages, if you can't prove to your CFO that there was a return on whatever that investment was, like I did a big ad campaign and I spent $2 million, but I sold $6 million worth of tickets. or I sold $6 million worth of Pepsi. If you can't prove that to the CFO's office, then the CFO is going to, and the CEO and the shareholders and everybody else will be going, like, what are we doing here? Why are we spending the $2 million again? Let's just not spend the money. And so you have to constantly measure the ROI of every dollar being spent in marketing. And if you can't do that with some precision and some proof that what you're doing is working, then that's going to be criticized, and then the spending will be the budget's reduced. And so and then what happens is it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, where the less you market, the less you engage, the less you sell, and it becomes a downward spiral. And that's happened to a lot of brands. And so it's like some attribution and measurement. So, there's been a proliferation of analytics companies in the sports space over the last 10 years, where it used to be, Nielsen Sports was the be all end all. They did all the TV measurement. They were the one-stop shop. Now there's a dozen brands that are doing different versions of media measurement in sport. And there's a lot of other companies that are doing sub measurements of different verticals, and consumer engagement and direct mail and things like that, and database management. So there's all these different technology tools out there, and a lot more data out there than ever before. And so, if you're not paying attention to emerging startups in data gathering and analysis and direct marketing and fan engagement, then you're really missing out, because that's an area that has to be stronger than ever before because of that change in the regulatory framework, and you can't really passively track people as much as you used to. So.
Interesting. And just shifting gears a little bit, just because I'm a bit mindful of time. But Chris, a lot of the work you do is also around kind of connecting startups with corporates and other organizations, right? And how, in your experience, has that been done most effectively in this space? And also, to what extent are partnerships more important in sports than in other verticals, if at all?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So there's two layers to that. One is, what we try to do on behalf of Comcast and our corporate partners as part of the program. And I've spent my whole life building partnerships for the purpose of driving business, right? So you can have great partnerships, but if you're a for-profit entity and that partnership is not focused on developing the business and growing the business, both of the startup and also of the large corporate, right? So you can trot in a bunch of cool technologies and you can tinker with them and do proofs of concept. But if there's not an end game, I'll call it, where you're generating revenue for the large corporate, or you're reaching some other objective like growing customer base or retention of customers, or those, like, you have to look back at the corporate goals. If that technology does not help further the corporate goals, then the executives are going to lose interest, because they're like, well, hey, this is a hobby then. It's not part of my day job. So what we try to do is make those partnerships part of their day job by saying, hey, Peacock, we know you're trying to grow subscribers. That's no secret. How do we use technology to get more subscribers for Peacock? And what are those startup technologies that make it easier to market to them and sign them on and keep them, so that you grow your revenue? And when you do that, then the people on the Peacock leadership team go, oh, okay, yeah, this makes sense. Go spend some time on it. But if it's just like, well, hey, we've got this cool technology and it might make this feature inside of Peacock better, but we don't know if it's going to make money for you, then it's like, that's cool. We'll spend a few hours on it, but then they lose interest. Like, so Chimera, like, that's a good example of a technology where we really believe that over time, Comcast can benefit from it directly and indirectly, because health and wellness of employees is really critical. They've got a whole force of people that are, putting cables into buildings and building servers, and there's some physical labor out there to service the technology. And Chimera is a tool that can reduce employee injuries and downtime and workers' compensation claims. Not the most obvious use case when you look at it on the surface, but that's one of our motivations for bringing in a Chimera, is to help Comcast Business figure out how to get that technology as much as possible on its employees to reduce downtime and increase productivity, which then translates to revenue and reduce expense and losses of revenue, things like that. So for us, it's all about developing business partnerships, not just friendships. We have friendships, but if the friendships don't produce revenue, then there's no business case, and then the monetization dries up, and then the platform loses steam. And so those partnerships are really critical. So we go around to all of the partners on a regular basis, and we're always learning about what's changing, what's new, what do they need, what do they not need. and that discovery process is ongoing, and because the companies are ever changing and people are always coming and going and leaving and restructuring and things like that. So without those partnerships, it's hard to say whether technology is going to be useful in the marketplace. And what we've tried to do is we have over 200 proofs of concept pilots and commercial deals under our belt so far, where the technology has proven to be useful on some level to multiple partners. And so, and then once those case studies happen, then we're able to go with a straight face to a lot of other partners and try to get them to use the technology too.
Tim, from the startup's point of view, how important have partnerships been for you guys?
Yeah, they're essential. And a bit we were talking about, and when you dropped off earlier, was the importance of that for us historically. Speaking specifically to the work we've been doing as part of Comcast Sports Tech, it's probably saved us between 12 and 18 months in terms of time, effort, if we were to achieve one of the prospective kind of pieces that we're working on, but actually then it's brought a higher volume as well. So in terms of measuring that impact, it's been huge, and not every organization thinks like that. So sometimes having the organization that does, who has the ear of the one that doesn't, as part of the long-term play, that's also incredibly valuable for us. And we've got to map out, okay, so using Chris's example, we start by supplying socks to Comcast service technicians because they're on their feet all day and they have a high instance of foot pain. That then maybe leads to Universal Parks business as part of the NBCU, CNBCU universe, so that they're all on their feet all the time, they're wearing it. That could then lead to a hospital, healthcare group, because they're nurses, they're porters, they're surgeons from their feet all the time. So all we're doing is selling now hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pairs of socks, but you can see very quickly how the prospective value for us as a business amplifies. And that all comes back to, doing a good job with your initial partner, and then making sure that you build that respect, translate that into the next one, make sure that when you've been given that favor of Comcast introducing us onto an Amazon or a UPS, for example, that we're doing right by them, that not only are we delivering a product that's great, but we give a great product experience, because there's social capital that's being spent from partner to partner. And that's one of the things that Boomtown and the sports tech team, with Jenna, for example, do really well, is that they will use that social capital to say, we have put our time into vetting this business and this partner that we've brought on as part of the family. We believe in them. You should too. And that's a very different dynamic to someone just, hey, I met someone at a conference, I'm just connecting because I thought you might be interested.
So, and maybe just to kind of wrap things up, because we only have 5 minutes or so left, but I wanted to ask each of you, I think Carrie and Chris from the investor side, and then Tim obviously from the startup side, what advice you'd give to peers of yours, investors and startups respectively, that want to either break into or go further in the sports space. And maybe Carrie, you can kick us off there for the last question.
Yeah. I think from the investor perspective, I'm kind of earlier in the process. I think Chris has had a lot more experience, seen a lot come across his table and deals and things like that. But from my perspective, I think looking for the things that can have the biggest impact across the board, and really setting and managing expectations early on, right? Like as I look at opportunities that come across our table, I want to see, I mean, it's really like founder led, right? Like I love a lot of founder led, really, they're almost maniacal about the mission and really trying to make an impact in what they're doing. But the fact that, where you enter and how it can expand and grow really makes a big difference. So everything that Tim just said in terms of, when you get a proof of concept, you get an opportunity to prove it to one person, one company, one organization, whether it's corporate or not. Like, you treat that with the respect that it deserves, because you never know what that can lead into, right? And I think just not taking for granted any opportunity that comes your way to prove it, no matter how small it may seem, but respecting those relationships, those introductions, and proving it out in a way that can give your business really the jolt of energy that it needs to get you to that next level. And I think that's what Chris and Boomtown and Comcast have done so well is they're aligning, you know, their goals and the goals of their partners with these technologies that they're seeing. And I think it's a genius way to do it, because you're not just providing them access to capital, but you're giving them like a true customer, a true way to get feedback on your product. And that's what most young companies want. They want as much feedback as possible to help them understand what's really going to move the needle for our end user. And then that's really how you scale, right? When you can tell that story of, hey, here's the problem that we're solving, here's what we're seeing, here's how we can move the needle from you, and understanding what you know, an individual company needs to grow and what their pain point is. If you can come in with that in mind and you're solving that pain point from the beginning, you know, everything else, you know, kind of takes care of itself as you go. And you know, there's other issues that may come up, but if you start there, man, it gives you such a head start on the competition. And I'll let Chris jump in, so I won't take all the time.
Yeah, thanks everybody. I think you know, in terms of looking at it from an investment perspective, I mean, the interesting thing about what we're doing at Comcast Sports Tech is, you know, people aren't necessarily coming to us because they're looking for just a check. And frankly, the biggest amount of value we deliver is sweat equity and know-how and our experience. And so if you're new to the investment game, or if you're trying to break into sports from a different investment vertical, what I would encourage you to do is invest in things that you know something about, so you can add more value than just the check. And then if you don't know enough about that area, surround yourself with experts who do, so that when you do your due diligence, it's not just looking at the financials and seeing a pretty deck and a nice person who seems to have a good background. You're really able to ask the tough questions of like, well, why did you build this, and what moat do you have, and what patents have you filed for, but also how do you compete with you know, what's the competitive landscape, and actually know whether their answers are realistic or true. I mean, and those are two different things, by the way. A true answer can be great, but it may not be realistic to actually compete and differentiate yourself. And so I would say, you know, if you're an investor who's looking to grow your investment portfolio or get into sports, find some sports experts that you can partner with on the due diligence side, but then also after the investment is made, make sure you have some people around you who can help that company grow intelligently and scale efficiently. Because there's a lot of good smart advisors out there that give well-meaning advice that sends startups in the wrong direction. And so having the right experts around those founders after the investment is made is equally important, I would say, to doing really strong due diligence. So.
I think those are all really fantastic points, and very much that point Chris was making there is very much resonates with me with regards to the right people around you. Because the day you think you're done learning is the day you should probably hang your hat up. Like, you can always learn more, and ideally learn from others' mistakes rather than necessarily how to navigate the ones you make yourself. But I guess as a piece of advice from the startup perspective, speaking to investors to look for this, and any companies, you know, founders on here that, you know, be this, is the sense that I'll quote one of my colleagues who always says, Tim likes to crawl, walk, run, but he wants to be running yesterday. And that is absolutely true. But the crawl is build up a solid foundation, understanding of the value that you bring as a business and the totality of that. That could be anything from moonshots to what you can readily achieve in the next 6 months. But the next 6, 9, 12 months, that's you walking. You know, learn to do that before you start running, because if you bite off too much in the beginning, and going back to the point that we've all made about having proof of concepts and doing a good job the first time round, if you burn that bridge and give a bad taste in that, you know, partner's mouth, then it's really going to limit you and put you on the back foot. So for me, I like to think that we as a business stay in a point of perpetual readiness, is the sort of phrase that I give, which is we know roughly what it will take to scale for a new opportunity once that opportunity is ready to commit to us. So that could be a defense contract. That could be Comcast scaling across and Chimera being part of their uniform provision. Like, whatever that may be, we understand what it will take to do that, but we're not ramping up production to make 1 million pairs of socks just in case Comcast want to buy them. But we can tell them, you know, probably within a 2-3 day turnaround, the exact lead time should that requirement come, so we can do a good job at it, because we've done the crawling, we've done the walking, we've got those foundations really solidly put together.
Awesome. And as is almost always the case in these things, here I am sitting looking at a bunch of things I wanted to get to that we just didn't have time for, unfortunately. But thank you so much, Carrie, Chris, and Tim for coming on and joining me today. It's been really interesting. And as a sports fan myself, I'm really excited to see where everything goes. So thank all of you for joining.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks very much. Have a great day.
So
Thank
thank
you. And before I go off, I'm just gonna share my screen for the audience, just to give you guys just a taster of other things that we have coming up at GCV. So later this month, we've got the GCV Symposium in London for anyone in Europe and beyond. Please do come along. It's a really great event. Happens every year, and each year it gets better. We also have the GCV Executive Leadership Forum in Menlo Park, California in October. The same month, we have the Corporate Venture in Brazil event for all you LATAM-focused people, either in LATAM or looking to invest there. Huge recommend for that one. It's always good. And of course, the GCVI Summit in March, biggest event of the year. Everyone always goes. Be there. And contact information here. And if you want to get in touch with any other panelists, please either reach out to them directly or through us, and we'll be happy to connect you. And that's about it from me. I'll be quiet and let you all go. Thank you all so much for joining. Bye-bye.